that I think that some of those nurses must have felt like they were actually helping. If you'll recall the conversation that, and I think they have more than one conversation, Sybil and Alicia have, and, saying, do you know, and I actually, when I was researching this, I looked up what the statistics were for teenage pregnancy and for poverty and all of the things, and they were really high for Black teenagers. And so in their minds, they, she and Alicia say, like, can you imagine a baby being born into that house where they live, that shack? Some of these women have 5 children. Do you really think they need another one? You can see, I think, a little bit how they get caught up in this idea of helping. And, my hope was that the reader might look at that and say, I can see that, like, it was wrong, and there's no question, but I can see how these young people working at this clinic might think, do you really want to bring a child into this particular situation? No, it would be best for everyone if this person was there. And in this case, in the case of these sisters, one is nonverbal, and this, I'm talking about in the book.
Yeah.
And, and they live in, abject poverty. And then, when I was drafting, one of my writer friends read a draft of the book, and she said, I'm sure that Nurse Seeger would have suspected that something had happened already to India, who's nonverbal, and that she couldn't vocalize it, and that she might even suspect the father. This is the way people thought. And so I had to address that in the book where, Sybil interrogates Erica one day, like, are you sure about your sister? Are you sure nothing has happened to her? Or, something that she couldn't tell us. And India's like, I'm sure, why are you asking me all these questions? So the complicity of those nurses is a question that I have. The only thing I can say is that there were a lot of forces at work in terms of the power and authority of the federal government. I mean, this went all the way to the White House.
All the way.
And also the, just belief that they were doing the right thing.
All right. Well, thank you. What are you working on next?
Well, it's kind of a jumble right now, so I'm not ready to talk about it. I've got just some pages that aren't really coherent. But it is another historical novel. It's a generational novel that goes from the late 1800s to present day of a Black family in North Carolina.
Oh, wow. Okay. Will there be some sex and murder in this one?
Sex, just make it. These are hard to write.
Why?
Yeah, I don't know.
Dolen, Maria again, I'm sorry, I was kind of out of the camera. I listened to one of your book club meetings, or maybe I read some, I can't remember, but Ted Kennedy was involved in this. Did you say that you read the court documents?
For that, yes, that we have a transcript of that subcommittee hearing, where the actual Relf family testified, and where Joe Levin spoke. And so some of that is actually taken verbatim and put into the book. Some of the speech that Joe Levin gave that day. It was real powerful.
And you met him, right? He's still in Montgomery, Alabama?
He's still in Montgomery. He's still alive. His memory is razor sharp.
Wow.
He remembers everything. When I went to see him back in 2017 and told him I was writing this book, he took the files from the case out of storage. They had been in storage for 45 years.
Wow.
He brought them out, and I was just stunned by how much he remembered. And I knew he was a source. And so did Mrs. Jessie Bly. She remembered everything. She's still in touch with the sisters. My personal approach to this was that I didn't want to disturb the sisters.
Right.
They live together. They, in my mind, they've been through enough.
Right.
Yeah.
And there was nothing really I needed to ask them, and I also just didn't wanna use them as like book promotion, you know?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
you know, the way I say, like, unless I'm going up in there with Oprah and she's gonna wave a magic wand and change their lives,
Yeah.
cause they're still living in public housing,
Wow.
you know? And so,
Wow.
you know, that wasn't something that I was willing to do. And my understanding is that the family is very protective of them. And the family feels like they weren't protected back then. I mean, clearly they weren't protected, but after they were sterilized, of course, there were lots and lots of reporters, there's lots of archival television footage of media people interviewing them. And, I mean, you know, for what? They never got any money.
Never got anyone.
Joe Levin won the case against the federal government, which changed the whole nature of informed consent laws. And actually, really, we should be reading about them in history books as the lead plaintiffs of one of the landmark cases of our time. But we don't even hear about them. So, there is an artist from Montgomery, Michelle Browder, who has set a GoFundMe for them, and you can just Google that and find it if anybody wants to donate. She's been trying to raise about 25,000. I think she's raised about 17,000. And she's a very nice person and a Montgomery native. Her father is a pastor. Like, I know that they're gonna get that money, but I feel like they deserve so much more.
Oh, absolutely. So did Joe happen to share why he chose to take the case? Because I know he was receiving threats and the family was receiving threats. I mean, has he talked to you about why he chose to take the case?
Well, he told me why he chose to become a civil rights lawyer. Joe is a Montgomery native, and he went to University of Alabama. And he said that at that time, the fraternities didn't allow Jewish students to pledge. And so he was a member of a Jewish fraternity, and they were the victims of vandalism and anti-Semitic hate crimes. And he said he had never experienced that before. And when he graduated, he moved to New York. I can't remember if he moved there for a job, but when he graduated college, he went to New York. And he met a lot of people from a lot of different places, and he, you know, began to think about what kind of change he could make. And this was in the late 60s. And he came back to Montgomery and became a civil rights lawyer. Jessie Bly, who was a girl social worker, discovered that the girls had been sterilized. Her husband was in the military, and she went to his commanding officer on the base and told him what had happened. She was very upset about it, and you can see in the notes, she was something else, y'all. She was like, you know, at one point, one of the nurses called her to check on the girls, and she hung up in their face, and they wrote in the note, like, social worker hung up on us, and we're just trying to see how they're doing. She was not having it. She was one of those, and she's still kind of no nonsense, you know, like, even when I talk to her, she's like, well, that's it, that's all I remember, good luck. And then when I called her to tell her the book was coming out, unfortunately, she didn't remember me, so, you know, she's getting up there in age. But she went to the commanding officer, and he recommended this young civil rights lawyer in town, and she went to his office, and she said he wasn't there, and she sat in the waiting room all day and waited for him.
Oh, wow.
And so when I went down there in 2017, he had not seen her in years, but he told me about her. I didn't know about her. And I was able to get her phone number, and I called her and asked her if I could take her to dinner. And he told me before I left, he said, you tell her I said hi. We did something special back then, and you tell her I still think about her and I've never forgotten her.
Wow.